Hey everybody, can I get a quick sound check? Can everybody hear me? Sweet. Well, thanks for coming everybody. Welcome to UCW Colorado's June seminar. My name is Barath. I'm a graduate worker in the aerospace department at CU Boulder. Today, we're joined by UCW member and a good friend of mine, Will McGrew, who will take us back to the Chile of the 1970s to analyze a exciting new socialist government's bold plans for a new economy. But before we get to the seminar, a few quick announcements. This event was organized by our union's education committee. If you're a member of UCW, we are looking for more volunteers to work on a number of new projects. We're hosting monthly seminars, which are open to the public and recorded for YouTube and Facebook. We're organizing a Toastmasters style public speaking group to help build communication skills among the membership. We're doing movie screenings, trivia nights, and generating educational content for our newsletter, social media, for magazines and pamphlets. And then we also have a weekly book club, which Will is actually the point man for. He runs the book club. So we're especially lucky to have him today. We also have a few other projects going on. One of the nice things that started up recently was the Union Library. It's essentially a spreadsheet where members can share and borrow books from each other. So check it out, add to it, borrow from it. I can't post the link here because it's a public event, but just check out the education channel on our union Slack or just private message me and I can get you that link. That's all the announcements for today. It's a short one. So we'll move on right to the main event. And I'm happy to introduce my friend Will McGrew. So Will is a postdoctoral researcher at the physics department at CU Boulder and is a member of UCW Colorado. We'll have time for a quick Q&A and discussion after the talk, but if you want to ask a question during the talk, please use the raise hand feature. The speakers or I can call on you, and then you can ask a question. Other than that, please keep your mics on mute, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Will, who will take us through cybernetics and democracy in Allende's Chile.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Barath. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, so I will be talking about cybernetics and democracy in Allende's Chile. And just in general, please feel free. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to see the raise hand feature from this mode, but feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question if there's anything that's not clear. In this talk, I'm going to be trying to condense a lot of ideas and a lot of history and a lot of really fascinating nuanced things. And so I don't want to skip over an important point if something doesn't translate. Anyways, I'll just get a laser pointer. Okay, so a quick overview. First off, I will talk about the viable system model. This is a theory of organization which was pioneered by the cyberneticist Stafford Beer. And this was kind of the backbone of Proyecto Synco in Chile. So it's really kind of necessary to have a theoretical understanding, at least at a a basic level about what the BSM is. Then I'll move on and talk about some very cursory history of Salvador Allende and the Unidad Popular government. And then with the kind of theoretical background and the historical practical background, I can proceed to Proyecto Synco, which is kind of the coming together of these two really vibrant dynamic strands. And the synthesis of, I think, something that's pretty much unique in human history. And then finally, I will talk about the tragic ending, the unfortunately tragic ending of Proyecto Synco and the Chilean government under Allende. But first, I will talk about the viable system model. So Stafford Beer maybe seems like kind of an unlikely person, at least pre-1970s Stafford Beer looks like an unlikely person to take the helm of constructing a socialist economy. He was a British management consultant who essentially took it as his goal to increase the efficiency of enterprises. And however, in the process of developing the VSM and then implementing it in Chile, he really kind of went through a personal renaissance and came to a new understanding of reality. And so if you look at the post-1970s Stafford Beer, you see kind of a completely different person and one who's been transformed by all of these experiences. But anyways, the early Stafford Beer was to a significant extent interested in sort of the technical side of operations. This is sometimes known as operations research, and it's really about just planning logistics, planning how to efficiently produce things and efficiently run organizations. However, as he delved more deeply into operations research, he became interested in the more general topic or concept of organizational design. So he wanted to know what type of organization is best for actually accomplishing things. Is it centralized? Is it decentralized? And so on and so forth. And as he delved into these topics, he immediately ran into management orthodoxy, which is going by the name of the org chart. And the org chart or organizational chart, it looks something like this graphic on the right side of my screen. There's someone who's the boss of the whole company, and then they have a number of immediate subordinates, and those subordinates have their own subordinates, and that's kind of how it goes. So it's extremely hierarchical. And the general notion is that everyone is responsible for their subordinates going down. So the VP of engineering is responsible for anything that happens under him. And as Stafford Beer looked into this more deeply, and especially looked at the actual practice of real firms, real enterprises, he came to realize that this was actually a fiction. The org chart is never really implemented precisely as depicted on the right. It's not really a means of organization, but rather a means of allocating blame. And he wanted to find something which really transcends this notion of an org chart and creates a more malleable and a more powerful notion of organization. And here's a quote that summarizes the problems with the org chart. Unhappily, the directors at, let us call it, group level are still constrained by the 3-pound computers in their skulls, just as is the head of the small business or the one-man band himself. I often think that if a scientist were to arrive from Mars and study our organization charts, he would inevitably conclude that the managing director of the corporation must have a brain weighing half a ton. That is to say, we organize ourselves in a way which the law of requisite variety and information theory in general cannot justify, unless the size of people's heads increase exponentially with their seniority. Unhappily, this is never true, except perhaps in a metaphorical sense. So the problem, aside from any concern with fairness whatsoever, is that the org chart as envisioned here is simply impossible. It's impossible for the manager to actually know about everything which happens under him or her. Okay, so he's looking for a better theory of organization, one that actually has descriptive power. It can explain why organizations continue to survive, as well as one that would have prescriptive power. So something which can explain how to change organizations to make them function better. And as he was coming to terms with this, he became interested in the literature of cybernetics. So I just wanted to spend a slide briefly going over the what the term cybernetics means. It was coined in 1948 by Norbert Wiener in the book Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine. It comes from the Greek kybernetike, which means steersmanship. This is sometimes described as the science of control, but I actually think a better definition is the science of effective organization. And really what cybernetics is interested in is the fact that there are deep similarities between seemingly disparate types of systems. You might have mechanical servo mechanisms, which have similar principles to a biological organization or even a social organization. And cybernetics is interested in pulling out those control principles. And so motivated by this notion that you can compare an animal and a machine at some deep kind of control theoretic level. Stafford Beer found what he believed to be a new basis for organization. And that basis was actually the human nervous system. The human nervous system was kind of used as a sort of metaphor as he was constructing the viable system model. And one thing to mention about the VSM is that it's not a formulaic scheme. It's not like you just fill in the empty boxes and then bam, you've got a viable system. It's kind of a way of thinking about organization, which allows you to solve real problems, but always in a way where you recognize that the viable system you've constructed now could no longer be viable in the future. So you'll need to reorganize, and it's kind of always in flux and never static. Now I'm going to, so the basis of the viable system is 5 systems, which are simply labeled systems 1 through 5. I'm not going to go into the systems in detail just due to time constraints, but I'll give you kind of the overall schema. So this is the notion behind the viable system model. This kind of squiggly amoeba type thing is the environment that the system lives within. In general, it's chaotic. It's often difficult to predict. The circle here is the operating units, and that's the part that interacts directly with the environment. So the environment changes the operating units, and the operating units change the environment, and there's a complex relationship between the two. And you need something else to actually take the disparate parts of the operating units and coordinate them and forge them into something which has its own sense of unity, its own sense of identity. And the thing that does that is the metasystem. And so essentially the metasystem observes the environment, it observes the internal details of the viable system, it observes the operating units, and then it works in such a way as to preserve the viability of the whole, understood as a whole. And the metaphor to be made here is that the components of system 1, or the operating units, are like the organs of the body, and those are regulated by, first of all, the nervous system, and then ultimately by the brain. Okay, I listed the systems here, though I won't actually go into detail about what each of these does. However, I would like to talk about a few design principles of the VSM that I think are really important to have a notion of. First off, well, a question you might ask is, how do you scale this? If you design a viable system at one level and then you're interested in something at a higher level, how do you go from the one to the other?
Did we all lose Will? I can't hear him.
Yeah, I lost him.
Yeah, same.
All right, hold on, everyone. Let me try to sort this out.
Should we do slides karaoke in the meantime?
I'm pretty impressed you had that on hand.
I'm a professional.
Sorry about that. I just had an internet outage. But I will start sharing screen again. Giving you a little unplanned preview. Okay, so this is the slide I was on. All right, so the design principle, how to scale. Well, you scale by having this recursive structure. The components of system one, for instance, the organs of the body, are in themselves viable systems. And this allows you to go from one level of recursion up and down and kind of fill in the gaps. Okay, there's another important design principle, which is that we have to decide what information to transfer. And as we talked about a little bit with the discussion of the CEO with the 3-ton brain, it's not possible to transfer all of the information because it would just overwhelm the metasystem. And in fact, the metasystem can only handle a tiny, tiny sample of all of the information which is available to be transferred. So how do we pick and choose what to transfer? A pretty good rule of thumb is to keep it negative. So if things are going fine in one of the components of system one, then you don't really need to send much information. It can just continue to operate autonomously and keep on proceeding. But if there's a problem, then it really needs to amplify that information and make sure that the metasystem is working to solve that problem. So you keep it negative, you send distress signals or pain signals when there's a problem that needs to be addressed. But if that's not the case, then you just don't send much information. Okay, design principle number 3 is, I think, an important one to keep in mind. Beer liked to refer to this as an acronym, POSAWID. The purpose of a system is what it does. So no matter what you think your system should be doing on paper, you design it with one purpose in mind. What it actually starts to do once it comes into operation is what its purpose is. It is what it does. And just one little example of this that I thought of is what is the purpose of charter schools? According to their stated purpose, the goal is to increase the amount of freedom that teachers have to teach children and provide children with choices, families with choices. But what do they actually do? Well, mostly they cause problems for teachers' unions and privatize education, and in general do things which are not in sort of the are not what they advertise themselves as doing. So this is always important to keep in mind, I think. The purpose of the system is what it does, not what you think it should do. Okay, and then design principle number 4. When I was talking about Beer's ideas about organization earlier, I mentioned that there's a debate which is often had where you say, well, should we be a centralized organization or a decentralized organization? And I think when you think about the terms of these debates for very long, it kind of starts to seem sort of ludicrous. It's almost like there's a dial and it goes from like perfectly centralized to perfectly decentralized, and you just sort of turn the dial. And of course, that's not what's going on. It's just not that simple. So the VSM is not either centralized or decentralized in any simple way. It's an effective organization. And just to build that out a little bit more, the viability of the full system requires that the components of system one have substantial autonomy. And that's because the metasystem just doesn't have the variety or doesn't have the capacity to handle all of the information that would be required to actually run it run everything in the entirety of the system. So on the one hand, there's got to be autonomy, but on the other hand, the coherence of the whole also requires that the metasystem at times overrides this autonomy. So there are times when the metasystem sees that there's a really substantial problem with the components, and it's not just a matter of sort of asking the components nicely to fix the problem, but it really has to issue commands and solve the issue. So there has to be autonomy, but it has to be an autonomy which is always sort of secondary to the coherence of the whole as a whole. And then I like this quote as well. Stafford Beer says, "This is the cybernetic argument for autonomy or freedom, as distinct from the ethical, political, or psychological arguments. Unlike these others, it has no emotive content. It is basically mathematical." And what I like about this is that I think in many cases, people act as if control and freedom are two opposing things which can never be coupled together. And I think that that's just not the case. In fact, if you allow the components of the system more freedom, then that can be good for the viability of the system up to a point. So these things aren't as antagonistic as we're often led to believe. Okay, so that is a lightning overview of the VSM. So now I'll talk about Salvador Allende and the Unidad Popular government. Salvador Allende was from an upper middle class background. He went to med school and worked as a doctor. And as a doctor, he was horrified by the condition of the Chilean peasants and workers, and he began to organize politically. He co-founded the Socialist Party of Chile and then went on to run unsuccessfully for president 3 times, in 1952, 58, and then in 64. And he was kind of known as you know, a nice guy who's never actually going to win. He was kind of dismissed in some circles as just being a little bit utopian, a little bit unsuccessful. However, and I just wanted to share one quote that I think kind of gives the flavor of his preoccupations and his interests in political involvement. "These same firms that exploited Chilean copper for many years had made more than US $4 billion in profits in the last 42 years alone, while their initial investments were less than US $30 million. A simple and painful example, an acute contrast. In my country, there are 600,000 children who can never enjoy life in normally human terms because in the first 8 months of their existence, they did not receive the elementary amount of proteins. My country, Chile, would have been totally transformed by these US $4 billion. Only a small part of this amount would assure proteins for all the children in my country, once and for all." And I think this really, I mean, you can sort of hear the doctor in him talking here, where he talks about how, oh, you need your proteins when you're a child, and we need to provide proteins for the children. He just had a real sincerity about him and a very practical way of thinking about what was really actually needed for the Chilean people. So he had run unsuccessfully 3 times, but then finally on the 4th of September 1970, he ran successfully and was elected president. And then just one thing to mention, the first song for people who arrived early was sung by Victor Jara, who's a very famous folk singer from Chile, and he wrote Vencedemos, which is the theme song for Unidad Popular. And really this support of folk singers was very important for the Unidad Popular government for reasons that will become clear later in this talk. However, Salvador Allende did not win in a very decisive way. He had 36.6% of the popular vote, which put him in first place, but barely above 35.3% for second place. And even aside from that, aside from the nearly non-existent mandate, he was also the leader of a front, which was a coalition of 9 separate left parties. This was called the Unidad Popular, Popular Unity Coalition. So he has a weak mandate and he's at the helm of a large and unwieldy coalition. It doesn't look too good for Allende. However, once in office, he started to act very forcefully in supporting the nationalization of Chilean industry. These nationalizations tended to be worker-led, and the role of the Chilean government was just to send so-called interventors to assist the workers as they were seizing control of their workplaces and set up new participatory governing structures. They were worker-led. However, Allende did believe in providing compensation for the owners of the company. So during his years, he nationalized the copper mines, which was the most important industry in Chile for reasons which will become clear later, as well. And he also nationalized the nitrate mines. And one kind of ironic note is that while he was nationalizing the International Telephone and Telegraph ITT system, he purchased ITT's infrastructure not for the amount that it was actually worth, but for the very small nominal amount that ITT claimed it was worth for tax purposes. So that is a pretty amusing note, I think. However, there were some storm clouds which were gathering over Chile during the early 1970s, and I'd really like to dig into the economic reasons why that was the case. So I've got a little graphic here, and it represents the domestic economy. In Chile, you have producers who produce commodities. They're sold. The currency of Chile is the escudo, so they're sold for escudos. And then workers are paid more escudos, they buy more things, they make more things. That's how the domestic economy works. However, there's a major issue in Chile, and it's an issue which is shared by a large section of the global South. Chile, over the course of centuries, has been drastically underdeveloped and does not produce many of the commodities that it sells. So it needs to purchase these from the world market. And of course, it can't purchase these with escudos because no one outside of Chile wants escudos. You can't buy anything with them. So it has to have a reserve of currency, US dollars, and then it can buy from the rest of the world in US dollars and get the commodities that it needs to survive and to flourish. But there's kind of an obvious problem with that, which is that there's a finite amount of national reserves, and the Chilean government does not print US dollars, they only print escudos. So once the reserves are gone, they can no longer buy commodities from the rest of the world. And the solution, of course, is that they need to export to get dollars to replenish their reserves. And as is the case with much of the world in the global South, for historical imperialist reasons, Chile has relied upon nearly a single source of commodities to export, which for Chile is copper. And so this system works. It can produce copper, sell it with the rest of the world, collect dollars, take those dollars, buy commodities, and use those commodities in the domestic economy. However, it's a very fragile system because it relies upon a single natural resource. And if the price of copper falls drastically, or if people just stop buying copper, then the whole economy of Chile is imperiled. Now, as I mentioned, the election of Allende was on the 4th of September, 1970, and I think probably no one will be surprised that the American government under the then president, Richard Nixon, was not very excited about Allende's presidency. And on 15 September, so less than 2 weeks after the election, we have notes of a meeting between the CIA and Nixon. And CIA Director Richard Helms took notes. 1 in 10 chance perhaps, but save Chile. When he says save Chile, he's talking about essentially removing Allende. Worth spending, not concerned. No involvement of embassy, $10 million available, more if necessary. Full-time job, best men we have. Game plan, make the economy scream. 48 hours for plan of action. So what did this actually look like? They're looking to sabotage the Chilean experiment, and the way that they chose to do that was to organize an informal blockade of copper exports from Chile. So as I showed before, Chile relies upon selling copper to get dollars, US dollars, to replenish their reserves. And once this blockade was in force, the US dollars stopped coming in, and they only had their reserves, which wouldn't last forever. And so after about a year, the reserves had been completely depleted, and Chile could no longer import consumer goods from the world market. The result of this is that the existing Chilean escudos are chasing fewer commodities, and this naturally leads to the devaluation of the escudo, which is to say it leads to inflation. So I've gone through this in kind of some maybe slightly tedious detail, but I thought it was necessary because you'll hear an argument often from the right that goes something like this. Allende was elected, he tried to do socialist policies, that was terrible for the economy, that led to inflation. And I think at this point, it's clear how false that argument is. The crisis was not driven by internal policy choices. It wasn't driven by the nationalizations. It wasn't driven by the institution of workplace democracy in Chile. It was driven by external causes. The America organized effort to, as Nixon said, according to the notes, make the economy scream. And it certainly did that. During the early 70s, the rate of inflation increased from a few tens of percent in 1971 up into the several hundred percent, peaking at over 500% in 1974. And so this soaring inflation was devastating. It led to workers essentially getting a pay cut because their wages no longer purchased what they could before. The commodity shortages led to rationing and having to wait in line for just the necessities of life. So all of this was devastating to the economy of Chile. However, the Chilean government understood that there were these issues, and they also understood that they couldn't keep this system in place indefinitely. If they were trying to create socialism, they couldn't rely upon capitalist exchanges to provide all of the commodities they need. And so they looked at developing a new type of economy, which became known as Proyecto Synco. So at this point, Stafford Beer gets an offer from the Chilean government, which is essentially to design the economy of Chile. Beer has already at this point sort of gone through something of a personal renaissance. He started to question the assumptions that had been present in his life up to that point, and started to look at redesigning things in a more profound way. And when he gets nearly complete freedom to pursue the project of creating a new type of economy, he jumps at the chance. He's extremely excited. However, it needs to get cleared by the Chilean government, and in particular, it needs to be cleared by Salvador Allende first. He could have stopped Proyecto Synco dead in its tracks. So Fernando Flores, who's the official who originally made contact with Stafford Beer, sets up a meeting with Salvador Allende. Going into it, Stafford Beer is to some extent dreading the meeting. He's been a high-powered business consultant for many decades at this point, and he's talked with very powerful officials, executives, so forth before, so he's not really awed by Allende's position. However, his experience has been that the higher up on the ladder he talks, the less anyone understands of what he's saying. So he's kind of pessimistic going into it that he can actually convince Allende of the utility of the project. However, he's kind of shocked as he talks with Salvador Allende that Allende really gets it. As Stafford Beer is going through the VSM, explaining the design principles, explaining system 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Allende kind of comprehends in a pretty intuitive way. And in his book, Brain of the Firm, Beer speculates that this might be in part due to Allende's background as a doctor. He has an intuition for bodies and the human nervous system, which allowed him to understand the VSM in a much more natural way. So anyways, he's talking with Allende. He understands that he's actually getting his point across. And he's going through the systems, and finally he gets to system 5, which is kind of the apex of the system. And what he's planning to say is, okay, Senor Presidente, now we're at system 5. This is the center of decision making in the viable system, and this is you. However, he doesn't get a chance to say that because Allende interrupts him and says, "At last, el pueblo," the people. And Beer is kind of taken aback by this. And to say the least, this is the type of reaction that he hasn't ever gotten from the CEOs he's consulted with in the past. But in any case, the meeting goes well and Proyecto Synco gets the green light. There are 4 components of Proyecto Synco. First off is Cybernet, and this is a network of telexes which will allow communication on a national scale. This is something which, were it to be implemented today, would be kind of trivial. You could communicate through internet connections, but that wasn't in place in Chile in 1971. So they had to get a bit more creative with allowing communications. The next part is the operations room, which is a new environment for decision. Then we have CyberStride, which is sort of the software that runs Synco itself. And finally, the Chilean economy software, Checo, which is designed to look at the world economy and predict future trends. So first off is Cybernet. This was cobbled together on the basis of a fortuitous discovery that there were hundreds of these telex machines just sitting in a warehouse owned by the Chilean government. And if you've never seen one before, this picture on the right is a telex machine. Basically, it's one step up from a telegraph. You type, and then what you type is transmitted through some wires and printed on the other side. And this sort of became the nervous system of the national economy that was planned for Proyecto Synco. And I'll also just make a little technical note that the information throughput of these machines only amounts to about 50 bits per second. So for instance, the internet connection that you're all using to watch this is probably about 1 million times larger than that. So it's very limited in terms of the throughput, but in fact, for the viable system model, it really doesn't need to have that much information throughput because it does assume that there's so much autonomy in each of the individual component system ones. And so you only need to send short messages and not even necessarily that often. And 50 bits per second is amply sufficient. Next up is the operations room. So Stafford Beer understood that the viable system couldn't just be a diagram on a piece of paper. It needs to actually be a physical location where you have people coming together, making connections, getting to know one another, and solving problems. And this is exactly what the operations room was intended to be. He called it a new environment for decision, and he had a few sort of funny sounding ideas about rules which were enforced with the ops room. On the one hand, you do have several displays which give information about the economy, of course, but he wanted to cut it down to a minimum and provide only the most important information rather than just overwhelming you and making it difficult to decide what's important and what is not. He also banned paper from the ops room. So he didn't want people to like have a piece of paper and just be scribbling on that and not talking with people and not engaging. There was also a bar in the ops room because he wanted to encourage kind of a convivial atmosphere. And finally, this was the embodiment of part of the Bible system. Oh, and I guess I didn't mention this, but this picture on the right is not an illustration, it's a picture. The ops room was actually constructed and used in a fairly limited way before the end of Proyecto Synco. And this might, like, if you look at the picture, it might sort of somehow resemble the war room from Dr. Strangelove or something like that. And it kind of has this elitist technocratic flavor to it, but that really wasn't what Beer envisioned for it. He wanted it to be a room which was used by workers' committees, not a sanctum sanctorum for governmental elites. So workers would actually enter this room, get a drink, talk with some higher ups, talk with other workers, look at the diagrams, understand where they fit into the larger picture, and then suggest their own improvements or changes based on their hyper-specific, hyper-local perceptions. Okay, the next part of Proyecto Synco was Cyberstride. This is a program suite which was meant to facilitate systems 4 and 5, so it's meant to facilitate the meta system. And the goal that Cyberstride strove to carry out was to maintain homeostasis, which is just basically a way of saying that it needs to make sure that the whole system remains viable. It needs to look at what's going on, see if there are problems which might not even be apparent from some of the descriptive statistics which are available, solve those problems, and keep everything moving along smoothly. One little kind of wonkish note, the prediction algorithm that Cyberstride used was based on this really interesting paper by Harrison and Stevens on a Bayesian approach to short-term forecasting. I think Bayesian statistics wasn't so heavily used then, but they were kind of to some extent at the forefront of it. And by 1973, 70% of the Chilean economy was plugged into Cyberstride. So it was really starting to play the role of a coordinating force for the entirety of the economy. Okay, the last component, CHECO, Chilean economy, looks at the world economy and seeks to predict future trends. Another little wonkish note, it was programmed in Dynamo, which is an early symbolic programming language, not dissimilar from LabVIEW. However, out of the 4 components, CHECO was the one which was really never operational in any sense. And there were basically 2 problems which prevented it from working. First off, the national statistics were delayed by something like 6 months. So by the time CHECO actually had the statistics to chew over, the world had changed and it was no longer able to actually predict the future. I mean, it needed to predict 6 months in the future to even predict the present. Another issue is that it used faulty orthodox economic models that just didn't really describe reality. Okay, so those are the 4 components of Proyecto Synco, and I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about the way that Proyecto Synco was explained to the masses. And this isn't just a matter of drumming up support for Proyecto Synco. This is really important because the VSM cannot be implemented in an elitist technocratic way. It really requires the components to be autonomous, and there needs to be popular buy-in for that to work. So there's plenty of issues with this, but one significant one is that the Chilean workers and peasants, the backbone of Allende's coalition, had low levels of formal education and significant rates of illiteracy. And so it was just hard to explain these concepts to them. However, there's one method which was open, which is by writing songs. As I mentioned before, folk musicians had played a really important role in Chile's socialist experiment. And in fact, one of these folk musicians, Angel Parra, wrote a song, Litany for a Computer and for a Child Who is Going to be Born. And this attempts to explain, and I think does explain, some of the importance of Proyecto Synco. So I'd actually like to play a recording of that right now. I will say, if you speak Spanish, you should probably avoid the translation, avoid reading the translation, because it's not a good translation. But at least here's the chorus, which I translated myself. We must stop the one who does not want the people to win this fight. We must bring together all the sciences before losing the patience of the millions that are waiting for bread and justice on the earth. And one thing to kind of pay attention to here is the way in which Para is trying to tear down the boundary between blue collar and white collar workers. He's trying to point out that there's a commonality between them. He invokes the image of a white collar worker removing his tie and working at hard labor to support other workers. And he also talks about the need to keep the technocrats accountable. So you can't just believe promises, but you really need to enforce that they follow those promises. And I'll share the video. Sorry, just taking a minute. Okay. And this is Angel Para singing some number of years later.
Will, we're not getting any sound right now.
Shoot, sorry. I think I know how to fix that. Are you guys hearing that now? Can you guys hear that?
We can hear it.
Okay, cool.
En el aire, el pueblo también confía cuando tiene conducción limpia y pura como el agua, tibia y clara como el sol. Hay que parar al que no quiera que el pueblo gane esta pelea. Hay que juntar toda la ciencia antes que acabe la paciencia de los millones que esperan paz y justicia en la tierra. Pan y justicia, no paz. Como el sol que está quemando la espalda al oficinista que se sacó la corbata, voluntario entrar en esta marcha terrena, descorriendo telaraña de ignorancia e independencia, exigir los beneficios que nos regala la ciencia. Vamos a echar para adelante, sí, para buscar la paz, y la paz la da la guerra. Si no existe la igualdad, hay que parar. Al que no quiera que el pueblo gane esta pelea, hay que juntar toda la ciencia antes que acabe la paciencia de los millones que esperan pan y justicia en la tierra. Igualdad, digo, ministro, promesero, vendedor, somos todos responsables de este niño que nació. Que entiendan los compañeros que quien lo cría responde, no solo por su pellejo, sino el de miles de hombres. Por eso digo en mi canto, cuidado con traicionar la lealtad con que el pueblo los ha querido premiar. Interventor detestable, regente o juez de la corte, debiluchos funcionarios, traficantes disconformes, o empiezan a andar derecho, o el pueblo los llama al orden. Hay que parar. Al que no quiera que el pueblo gane esta pelea, hay que juntar toda la ciencia antes que acabe la paciencia. Eso era más o menos.
Okay. Okay, so that was Angel Parra's song attempting to explain the importance of Proyecto Synco to the Chilean people. Okay, so the economic crisis is continuing to accelerate. The inflation is getting worse and worse. And on 12 October 1972, Chile is hit by a pretty devastating news. There are these groups called gremios, which were guilds of independent truckers, and they decided to cease deliveries entirely in order to damage the Popular Unity government. The gremios organized about 70% of Chile's trucks, and all of these were taken out of commission overnight. And Chile at this point really faced the possibility of complete instantaneous collapse of their economy. They just couldn't move things around. However, there was a very unlikely hero which appeared, and that's the telex machine. So as I mentioned, this is really an existential threat for Allende's government. However, the fact that we had Cybernet in place at that point allowed the government to step in and use that network of telex machines to send commands and very carefully and studiously reappropriate the 30% of Chile's trucks which remained loyal to the government and actually continue to make deliveries. And due to the existence of these telex machines, the economy was barely affected by the gremios' action. And this, so Proyecto Synco was never fully implemented. However, many of the principles behind it have been validated, most strikingly maybe with this use of Cybernet. Okay, so here is where we start to talk about the end of Proyecto Synco and the end of Allende's government in general. Now, on March 4th, 1973, there was another midterm election which reappropriated parliamentary seats. And during this time, Chile had experienced 3 years of devastating inflation and economic stagnation. And there was no end in sight to the depression, which had been caused by the copper blockade. And so polls at that time were predicting that Allende would fall below 1/3 of votes. This 1973 election, if Allende did reasonably well, or at least didn't do terribly, it wouldn't end his presidency. That would continue until 1976. But if he fell below 1/3 of votes, then that would trigger his exit from office and end the Unidad Popular government. And it was, it really seemed likely, both in terms of what had happened with the economy and also with what the polls were predicting, that that would happen. However, to the surprise of pretty much everyone, not least being Allende and the Popular Unity government, their share increased substantially. They had originally taken power with a slim plurality of 36.6%, and that had risen to 42.7%. So they're starting to push closer to a majority. So this is obviously great news for the Popular Unity government. However, it has kind of a dark side, which is that the enemies of Allende's government realized that blockade and sabotage were not working, and they needed to shift their means to employ less subtle tools. One final note, there was actually another action by the gremios, the independent truckers, in August of 1973. And this was also foiled by Cybernet, which organized the remaining truckers. However, in 11 September 1973, the General Augusto Pinochet carried out a coup, which removed Allende from power. Tanks attacked the presidential palace, and Unidad Popular supporters were collected and massacred and tortured en masse. It's impossible to know the full death toll, but it's estimated that somewhere around 3,000 were killed during these days and about 30,000 were tortured. Many of the arrested were rounded up in Santiago Stadium, and among these was Victor Jara, the folk singer who had ridden Venceremos. And while in detention, he was tortured. His hands were broken, and he was presented with a guitar and mockingly told to play a song. And then finally, he was riddled with over 40 bullets. As the tanks were approaching La Moneda, the presidential palace, Allende released one last transmission with his private radio transmitter to the Chilean people. And I'd like to read an excerpt from that. Placed in a historic transition, I will pay for loyalty to the people with my life. And I say to them that I am certain that the seed which we have planted in the good conscience of thousands and thousands of Chileans will not be shriveled forever. They have strength and will be able to dominate us, but social processes can be arrested neither by crime nor force. History is ours, and people make history. Workers of my country, I have faith in Chile and its destiny. Other men will overcome this dark and bitter moment when treason seeks to prevail. Go forward, knowing that, sooner rather than later, the great avenues will open again, where free men will walk to build a better society. And that was on the 11th of September, 1973. shortly after releasing that broadcast, he shot himself in the head as soldiers were entering his private rooms. And so that's the end of the experiment. Pinochet went on to rule from 1973 to 1990, and Proyecto Synco was quickly terminated by the government. One little ray of light, I suppose, is that actually very recently, on October 25th, 2020, a plebiscite in Chile was held, which determined by a very wide margin to replace the Pinochet-era constitution. And so despite these decades of dictatorship, there is more light for the Chilean people. And finally, there are many lessons we can draw from the struggle of the Chilean people to create a new type of economy in the years 1971 to 73. And that's all I have for all of you guys. I'd love to answer questions now. Oh, actually, I have one more thing. Just if anyone's interested in learning more about Chile and Proyecto Synco in particular, I would recommend Stafford Beer wrote a trilogy of books on the VSM, and especially I would focus on the first one of those, The Brain of the Firm. It was released prior to Proyecto Synco, and then he released a second edition with 5 chapters talking about the implementation. So that's a really great book. I'd also recommend, there's a book by Eden Medina, Cybernetic Revolutionaries, which talks about the implementation of Proyecto Synco. If you're interested in the VSM guide, there's a really great if you're interested in the VSM as an organizational model, there's a really great guide written by John Walker, who's kind of been active in the cooperative movement and has a lot of ideas on how to implement VSM for cooperatives, but also if you're interested in implementing it for anything else, it'd also be interesting. There's a Netflix documentary talking about Victor Jara's murder, Massacre in the Stadium, and that's a good one to watch. And if you're into podcast, General Intellect Unit identifies as the podcast of the cybernetic Marxists, and they have a lot of content talking about the VSM and Stafford Beer, as well as Proyecto Synco. Okay, now I'm actually done.
Thanks a bunch, Will. This was really awesome. I'm glad that we could make this happen. So just really quick before we start the question and answer, I usually don't like to interrupt again after this point. So wanted to wrap up, thank Will. Also welcome back to Colorado. It looks like you're home. Yeah, so we do these every month. If you are not a member of UCW Colorado, but you are a worker at the University of Colorado, we would love to have you join your union. You can find more about us on our social media pages. There's a YouTube channel. This talk is going to be uploaded there. And the final announcement is that we have a fair budget petition going on right now. We're trying to basically, what the budget says essentially, what the petition says is that workers need a better voice in the actual budget priorities and the budget decisions and the amount of the budget and everything that has to do with how the CU's finances are created and managed. That's all. Hope you guys can sign that, share that with your friends. Other than that, I'll turn it back to Will and you can take us to the end. I think we have a small enough group here that people can probably just shout out their questions. So feel free to unmute and ask away. Actually, I'll go first. I have one. Can you speak much to what the role of the USSR was in helping this fledgling socialist state, especially like when you were talking about the lack of reserves and like this desperation for dollars, were powers like the Soviet Union or China able to assist, or did they want to?
Yeah. You know, as from everything I know, the role of the USSR or China was practically negligible. I don't think they really did that much one way or the other. In this period in particular, the USSR was pretty wary of instigating fights with the United States, and so I think they probably just took a back seat and watched things happen. There was some more solidarity that came from Cuba, actually. Fidel Castro visited Chile and gave a speech, and I mean, when it comes to things like solving crises where you just don't have enough commodities, there's not that much Cuba can do because it's smaller than Chile and not particularly wealthy in itself. But as I understand it, they did what they could.
Thanks. And then you might have mentioned this at the end, I didn't catch it, but one of the interesting things I remember learning is that Allende killed himself with a gun that Fidel supposedly gave him on his visit to Chile. So yeah, there was clearly some Cuban solidarity.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. Yeah.
Will, do you think this kind of system could work somewhere in like the US in the modern day?
Yeah, in the modern day, yeah, I mean, it definitely could. So I mentioned briefly, there's this guy, John Walker, who's worked on applying it to a lot of cooperatives. And it's a pretty popular, I mean, often when businesses transition from being a private, like a private sector for-profit organization to one where it's run in a cooperative way with workers' democracy, there's often issues which come up where like just making decisions for the organization becomes difficult because I mean, democracy can take a lot of time, right? And so having something like the VSM kind of gives more structure for a lot of cooperatives, and it's been pretty widely applied. And of course, that is cooperatives within, you know, modern day America or Spain or what have you.
Could it work for a union?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the viable system model is not, it's kind of a model for any type of organization, and it's built with enough flexibility that it can kind of be adapted. And of course, a viable system which is good for a cooperative or even the Chilean economy is not, it's going to have certain deep similarities between a viable system which is good for a union, but there are going to be differences between them as well. But absolutely, it could work for a union.